What's going on, everybody? Will Blake here, running for Ward 4 City Council here in this May primary. But I want to let you guys know that I'm sitting here today with Mark Greer. Yes, he's a mayoral candidate, but we are here to talk about a very, very near and dear thing to his heart, the Innerbelt. So stay tuned. I think this is going to be a good conversation, and I think you're going to get something out of it. Thank you for coming this morning.
Thank you, sir.
So a lot of people don't know about what the Innerbelt was. They don't necessarily have a background on it, albeit others do. But give us a brief history on what the Innerbelt was, what it meant to communities here in Akron, and we can dive into more details after that.
So I think what happened with the Innerbelt, this projects like these that were termed urban renewal happened a lot during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, not just here in Akron, but all across America. And with the 1956 Federal Aid and Highway Act, what happened is that the feds actually authorized the construction of 41,000 new miles of highway. And many of these highways, though, ran right along our city centers and traditionally through predominantly black neighborhoods.
Wow.
And so when the Innerbelt was implemented in the 70s and the 80s here, it ran through largely black neighborhoods in West Hill, in Oak Park, and it affected other neighborhoods like Lane Wooster, now known as Sherbondi Hill, and Opportunity Parkway and Grant Washington. So when we look at how these urban renewal projects were implemented, they displaced black families, they destroyed black business hubs like Howard Street, like Lane Wooster, West Thornton Street, and the impact was drastic, particularly on our black communities when we look at the wealth that was stolen.
I mean, what were these communities like, specifically closer to Howard Street, prior to this urban renewal? What did these particular communities encompass? What was the vibrancy there? What was the energy there?
Well, I think two words that you hit on. You said vibrancy and the energy. And I think when we look at what Howard Street was, it was a vibrant social and economic hub of the black community here in Akron. My mom, who was born and raised in the rural South in Alabama, she moved up here to Akron after high school.
It was a big city.
Exactly.
That had, the rubber factory going back then.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so she joined my aunt and my uncle here, and she would tell me the stories of how on the weekends, they went out on Howard Street.
So it was happening.
Oh yeah, it was happening then.
It was lit.
Exactly.
Hey.
Exactly. And I mean, when we also look at, during that time, you could find everything you needed in the community in which you lived.
So they had all the resources there, whether it was the grocery store, banking, entertainment, business.
We also had ownership.
So people actually owned not just the businesses, but the buildings the businesses were in, the homes they lived in.
Homes, largely so.
Wow, okay.
And so, especially when we talk about ownership and in the context of building wealth, in the context of economic mobility, that is a key component that we can't really overstate. Because since World War II, we know that the main source of building wealth in the middle class has been owning your own home.
Exactly.
But when urban renewal comes in and all of a sudden we have entire neighborhoods that are deemed blighted, and we have to really look at why that happened, because even going back to 1939, we had things like the Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining guides that literally designated black neighborhoods as blighted based on the infiltration of a lower grade population and an undesirable element that they actually wrote on the guides as Negro.
Wow.
So
like
we have to look at
to this day, you can see those
Exactly.
old guides and it says Negro on there.
You can look at those guides, and they will always say the percentage that's white, the percentage of foreign-born, and then by itself there will always be a percentage of Negro. And
Wow.
the higher that population was, the lower that neighborhood was graded. So when you have people who were black, who lived in a neighborhood, and because their neighborhood was ranked low, well, then banks wouldn't give them home loans, or they couldn't get a home equity line. And so when you can't fix up your home, then fast forward 30, 40 years later, then we see why a lot of these neighborhoods are now deemed as blighted, so now we can raise them.
Wow. So when it comes to the economic consequences of that urban renewal and that new development, what were some of those consequences that happened due to that?
Well, I think we start with the wealth that was stolen. Again, if you own your home and you're able to maintain your home, that's how so many of us build equity. That's how people pass down wealth generationally. But if you don't have that home to pass on, right, then the generational impact has really been one of the most tragic results of urban renewal. Then even looking at it beyond just home ownership, but if you had business districts, business corridors like Howard Street, like Worcester Avenue, like West Thornton Street, the impact of seeing those things go away. A lot of those business owners at that time, when they lost their business where it was, they didn't go and then reopen that business in another location. So again, when we talk about ownership, that is an important aspect of us determining our own future, right? And so when you own something, you're really the captain of your own ship.
And you treat it differently.
Exactly.
You treat it differently.
I think, you know what, even when we look at it from a generational standpoint, you know, if you have a parent who owned a business, right, and then you could follow in their footsteps in the business that's already created, that's a lot easier than you've never had a business owner in your family, and now you're starting from scratch. You know, when we talk about wealth and generational wealth, it's hard to build it quickly when you're starting from zero. And urban renewal took so many of our black neighborhoods literally down to zero.
And taking those black neighborhoods down to zero meant that people that lived in those neighborhoods got displaced.
Right.
Where did they get displaced to? I mean, was it specific communities? Did people just get scattered about? I mean, how did that process end up impacting people from a geographical standpoint?
Well, it's interesting. I think, first of all, when we look at the urban renewal here, it actually happened in stages. So even though the Innerbelt construction started in 1970, it didn't end until 1987.
That's recent.
Right, exactly. I mean, I was alive then, right? And but the other issue and part of that is because of racial inequities and segregation in housing practices, black families who were displaced didn't just have their choice of going anywhere. In fact, because their homes were so devalued, they didn't receive fair compensation for the homes that they lost. And so they were unable to buy a nicer home in a nicer neighborhood. So then what happened is you had a lot of people scattered abroad. And one of the big impacts, I think, of urban renewal that we don't often talk about as much is that loss of community. Because when you think about if you were raised in an area where you knew who your neighbors were,
Facts.
you looked you looked after each other, right? Your next door neighbor, if they saw you doing something wrong, they could call your mom or dad and tell you, wait a minute, so-and-so did this, and then you know what would happen.
You'd face those repercussions. Y'all know about facing repercussions.
Exactly. But I mean, when we lost that sense of community, I think the impact of that can actually not be underestimated, because community is not only what binds us together, but it's also what enables us to move forward as a people. And so I think urban renewal really attacked community.
And when I think of community specifically, I think about the African concept of Ubuntu,
right?
Which is the collective we. It means that the well-being of myself is inextricably linked to my community and who's around me.
Right.
And if I don't have a sense of community, if I don't have a sense of ownership, if I don't have a sense of belonging, then I won't thrive. So I don't know if you have any stats on it or not. I'm not looking for that specifically, but has there been a decline in a sense of community in Akron over the past few decades?
Well, I think just simply looking around you,
all right,
you see that.
Yeah.
Look at Howard Street today, and then go back and look at some photos of Howard Street in the 50s and 60s.
Oh, I've seen those.
Right?
I've seen you. It looks like a totally different city.
Oh yeah, of course.
And to think about what that could have become and developed into further down the road,
right?
With ownership, decade after decade after decade, I actually can't even really imagine it.
Not to mention though, look at it even in this context. Look at other quote unquote black business corridors now. How many of them can you designate? Right? I mean, I think that is one of the most tragic legacies of urban renewal. I mean, look, I grew up on the west side. If you look at Copley Road, the majority of the businesses and the buildings owned there are actually not black-owned building structures.
Okay,
right?
I feel it.
We have a number of black-owned businesses that are specifically those in the service industry, so barbershops, hair salons, and so on. But in terms of a business corridor where compare and contrast that to what Howard Street was, what Wooster Avenue was, what West Thornton Street was, you can't find everything you need in our corridors now.
Yeah.
So what happens is that the revenue leakage is significant, because now we have to go outside of our communities in order to purchase goods. And so we are putting our wealth in other communities where we don't necessarily live, whereas when we had ownership in our own neighborhoods, in our own communities, we were building wealth. And building wealth in our own community is essential when we talk about closing the wealth gap here between whites and blacks. Look, we had the Elevate Akron report from 10 years ago. It showed us about the huge disparities in terms of median wealth between black and white. Well, until we address these systemic inequities, we're not going to bridge that gap. And we're not going to bridge the wealth gap if our wealth keeps leaving our communities rather than staying within them.
And to speak about that, I think it's really interesting because I was looking it up and I couldn't find in the West Akron Community Award for a bank. The closest one I knew of was the Huntington and RSVP, not an urgent care. Couldn't find a second grocery store in the West Akron Community Award for. And I don't know if there is particularly anything that's mandated to make sure that communities have they're essentials. Because to me, my thought is it's a concern of accessibility. I was talking about even entertainment and how a lot of people feel like they have to come downtown for entertainment. And not being able to have entertainment is robust as a downtown in the individual communities, I think also speaks to the lack of ownership and vibrancy that communities could have. I mean, the stage is set now. We know that redevelopment has to take place. If you were mayor, how could you even go about that process? How could you go about making sure communities had what they need, development could happen, and we could have bigger and more vibrant communities? And specifically in my case, a Ward 4, in that corridor there on Copley Road, how could it be more vibrant?
Yeah, well, I think, it's interesting when you look at our various wards, there are parts of them that have certain resources, right? Mm-hmm. And then there are parts of them that don't. And, Copley Road, as an example, that's an area where I've done a lot of work in the past several years, but there's an issue when I can see the east side of Copley Road literally have more vacant lots than businesses. And we see that we have to really address these things head on and in order to affect real change. And when we're talking about the Innerbelt and urban renewal and making sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past is so important. But I think the only way we do that is we have to intentionally address those mistakes of the past. Mm. So because we know that urban renewal robbed these predominantly black neighborhoods and families and business owners of their wealth, of their equity, then in order to have a real solution there, then we need to make sure that we are now building equity, building wealth in the people who were directly impacted.
And what does building wealth look like?
So I think that, whether we're looking at housing, whether we're looking at targeted incentives in terms of housing ownership, businesses, in terms of those who were directly impacted. I feel this so strongly that the solution has to address the original transgression. That just because we put a bow on something doesn't make it a gift, right? So while it may sound like a great idea, for example, to have a park, well, I'm all for parks and I love parks, but is putting a park where the Innerbelt is addressing the generational wealth that was stolen from those predominantly black neighborhoods? Wow. We have to make sure that we clean the wound in order to see it heal. We can't just put a bandage around a wound that hasn't been cleaned and think, okay, everything's fine now. So I think part of the way that we ensure that we don't repeat those mistakes is by, in every solution, we actually endeavor to solve as much as possible, but solve the mistakes of the past in order for us to forge a right vision going forward.
Okay. No, I understand that. And I think that can bring a better sense of community. That can bring a better sense of hopefully ownership and putting ownership back in the hands of the people. And absolutely. I think that also means that more vibrant communities can happen.
Yes.
Man, wow. I just want to thank you for making time. I mean, I know you're busy. You're running for mayor. You're on the board of Tuesday Musical. I don't know what you don't do because you're such an impressive pianist as well. Thank you for making time for sitting down with me. Thank you for making time for being able to explain what has happened in the past, ways that we can move forward and build more vibrant communities. And remember, you guys, if you are a candidate, I want to talk to you. whether it's in a group forum, how I've done before, whether it's a one-on-one. I want to hear your vision for Akron. Are you willing to invest in arts and culture to build vibrant communities? Raise the quality of life with economic development, more affordable housing? Or are you even willing to invest in our youth to build more vibrant communities even after you and me are gone? Tap in with me because I want to hear from you. And everybody, make sure you stay tuned, and I'll see you next time. Thank you again, Mark.
Thank you, sir.
Blue's more than a color. Blue is an attitude.
Black media, black media, black media, black media, black media.